Welcome and good afternoon. Thank you for standing by. I'd like to inform all participants that your lines have been placed on a listen-only mode until the question and answer session of today's call. If you'd like to ask a question at that time, please press star followed by 1 on your touch-tone phone. I'd like to inform all participants that today's call is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I would now like to turn the call over to Ms. Joyce Rose. Thank you, and you may begin.
Thank you, and welcome to the Child Welfare Information Technology Systems Managers and Staff webinar series brought to you on behalf of the Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families, Children's Bureau. I'm Joyce Rose, your host and facilitator for today's discussion. Today's webinar features a diverse panel discussing lessons learned while implementing mobile solutions for child welfare. Next slide, please. So, let's meet our panelists. And we are very pleased to have both state and county participants offering differing perspectives. From the state of Washington, Division of Children, Youth, and Families, we have Ann Hunt, the Compliance Manager, Kevin Kukas, Products Manager, Neil Edgin, Child Welfare Application Director, Christian Doran, Mobile Application Project Manager and Scrum Manager. From the state of Minnesota Information Technology Services, we have Tom Kine, who is Director of the Microsoft Application Development Division. And from Carver County in Minnesota, we have Michelle Seelinger, Child and Family Manager. And from Winona County in Minnesota, we have Mark Anderson, their IT Director. Next slide, please. Attendees are encouraged to participate in the roundtable with questions or comments. All of the participant lines are muted now, but we will open them for the Q&A session at the end of the discussion. Please be aware that you can submit questions at any time using the GoToWebinar chat feature, and those will be queued up and addressed during the Q&A session. As an FYI, to comply with 508 standards, please note that addresses will be read aloud. Once today's roundtable has ended, you may submit questions to cwis.questions@acf.hhs.gov or to your federal analyst.
That email address is ccwis.questions@acf.hhs.gov. Previous webinars are posted and can be accessed at www.acf.hhs.gov/cb/state-panel-cloud-computing. Next slide, please. Our roundtable participants will provide a short refresher of their respective mobile implementations, followed by an in-depth discussion of related topics. We're going to talk about, again, the design for caseworker mobility from both Washington and from Minnesota. We're going to do a lessons learned panel discussion with lots of interesting questions, followed by an attendee Q&A, and then we'll do a short wrap-up. Next slide, please. So let's start with the Washington State Child Welfare Mobile Network, and I will turn it over to Neil Edgin to explain. Neil?
Thank you. Yeah, this is Neil, and I'll start by kind of giving a high-level explanation. This may be kind of some technical information in this, but I assume that much of our audience is technical. So Washington started in 2016 to build a native mobile application, and one of our goals going into it was that we wanted offline capability, and that's why we chose the native mobile app. After some research, we decided to go with the Apple or the iOS platform and use Xamarin as our building tool because the expertise that we had in-house was in writing .NET. Now, Xamarin is a tool that you can use to build a mobile application using .NET, and it will render to either Apple or Android or Windows Phone, if anybody's even using that anymore. So early on, we decided that we wanted to have a contractor that would come on site with us and be able to provide some agile training because we were essentially a waterfall shop. We wanted to sit side by side with them and write the application together and own the code at the end. So that was really important to us. We wanted to be, make sure that we were able to support the application going on forward. So the security that we considered with this, because of the nature of the data, we had to make sure that it was, ultimately secure. So on the diagram on the lower left there, where you see the MDM wrapper, that's a mobile device management, and a mobile device management tool has essentially three components. The wrapper, which is actually the proprietary code that you write into the application, the cloud-based relay, and then the enterprise gateway. And basically the application is registered with the cloud relay, meaning that the cloud relay, the service, is aware of the ID of the phone, or it's an IMEI number, and also the IP address of the phone. So once the relay knows the identification of the phone, it can validate that through the relay into the enterprise gateway, and the user is then authenticated into the network through Active Directory, through that enterprise gateway. So coming in through the gateway allows access to the API, which is connected to our, I have on here SACWIS. We've actually declared CWIS. So that is our legacy system. And so the API is a RESTful API. In other words, it communicates using the HTTP protocol and using JSON as the protocol or the type of data. So going the other way in the diagram, it actually goes through a load balancer, and this is once you're authenticated, the user is, say they're getting a list of cases, and that will go through the load balancer, because early on we discovered that performance was potentially an issue. There's several methods that call and get data from the database, and so that is. Okay. Sorry, I'm going to back up a little bit here. In the application, there is a SQL database. It's a SQLite database. You'll see it in the lower left there, inside the MDM wrapper. When the user first logs on, that data is loaded from the SACWIS system into the phone so that they have offline capability. So say a social worker has a caseload. Once they log into the application, it gets all of that data and stores it locally, so that if they go throughout the day and they're offline, they'll be able to access that information and add information to that case, and then it'll synchronize once they're back in touch with the network. So we did some load balancing during the development and discovered that we needed multiple nodes on our API. And in talking about the API, we've developed separate modules and controllers for business and core programming to meet the CWIS requirements. So those APIs were built with that in mind. There's also connectivity to some responsive web applications that are both accessible from the SACWIS system and from the mobile device. And the last thing is the content management system. The application has the ability to do file uploads and view those files through the content management system. So that's Washington's network.
Thank you, Neil. I see on your diagram that your end user devices are either a phone, which I assume is an iPhone, and also a tablet. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. We target the iOS platform, but the native application is responsively designed so it works well on either a phone or a tablet. Both of them have the same code. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. And given the state-managed, county-administered governance structure of Minnesota, I would ask Tom Kine to explain the state role, how each county hosts their own solution, and then Mark Anderson to describe the Winona County configuration, which may be typical of other Minnesota counties. Tom?
So for those of you who don't understand state supervised county administered, if I explain this right, you should be horrified, or at least sympathetic to me. The counties in Minnesota are independent political entities, and in a state-supervised, county-administered model for social services, the state interfaces with our federal partners at ACF and sets policy for the system, child welfare, and for the system. But the county actually administers the various social service programs. So social workers are employed by the counties, not by the state. And the state has an oversight role in this. It made it challenging initially to have a SACWIS system even established within the state of Minnesota because the counties are independent, so we had to garner agreement from all the counties that we would have a uniform system statewide, and the counties participated financially in funding the initial development of that system, so there was a lot of complexity involved in both the politics and the financing of the system, and that is still the case in Minnesota. The counties are generally, I would consider them first-class stakeholders in the system. There is a county-state steering team that sets direction for SACWIS overall, but there's a wide degree of latitude in how counties use the system. So the Minnesota SACWIS system is built similar to a COTS product such as an SAP and is independently installed in each of the counties and county infrastructure, but communicates back to central servers for a variety of functionalities such as unduplicating clients, viewing cases across county lines, and so on and so forth. So there is a system footprint in the counties, and historically counties have had ODBC read-only access to those local data stores in the counties. We are in the process of centralizing our infrastructure. We're also have declared for CWIS, so we'll be making modifications in accordance with CWIS. I would say, though, in general, from a technology perspective, the Minnesota SACWIS anticipated, in spirit at least, the CWIS requirements, and it is possible to access the data and so forth via SOAP, and we'll be migrating that towards RESTful services. So when it comes to implementations of a mobile caseworker solution, the counties have had the ability, because they have access to the data in their counties, to implement solutions independent of the state. And early in, when some solutions started being proposed for Minnesota, a joint decision between the county and state was made to not pursue a uniform system statewide at that point. That may change in the future, but that was the decision. So with that being said, various counties, including Winona, have implemented several differing solutions across the state. And I think I'd wrap it up there, Joyce.
Okay. Mark, you want to walk us through your schematic, please?
Sure. I appreciate Tom saying that it could be horrifying to look at the way state of Minnesota is set up. Let me go back just before I talk about the diagram. A number of years ago, 2009, we were about ready to implement a new content management, document management system. And at that time, walking around with a content management system, everything looked like it could be solved with it. So we started scanning and developing workflows and really moving forward pretty quickly across the organization to try to get a handle on all the documents. We've created over the past 170 years. And when we started looking in human services, there was what we considered really a big opportunity to make the life of the people working in human services and community health better by automating some of the work that they do and auto-filling and working with their documents in digital format. And it naturally led us towards looking at mobile devices, get the information and the work as close as we could to the people that were going to be served. We're not a large county. We're the warmest county in Minnesota. So if you guys are ever in Minnesota, Winona County is the place to go. So we partnered with 5 other counties, and we formed a small collaborative to do this type of work. And we used our content management, document management system as the basis of providing, well, in the upper right corner, we've got the content management system as OnBase. We're not large enough to have programmers on staff, and not really even large enough to buy a lot of programming time. So we looked at what was available, and OnBase, or Highland, who has the OnBase product, had a spin-off called Northwoods, and they were a bunch of human service-oriented document management, content management, and workflow management-oriented specialists. So we partnered with them, and we also chose the iOS platform. That had a lot of reasons, but when you look back what it was like in 2009-10, there wasn't a lot of mobile devices that were capable of doing what a Apple iPad or a iOS-driven device could do. So we started development that way, working in concert with our vendor to develop a solution. And part of what we were looking at when we did it was providing the tools that the worker needed in the field. We needed a camera, video recorder, signature capability, all the files that were necessary for the workers to do their job out in the field. And we also needed it to be safe, so mobile device management, being able to brick a device or find a device and recover from a loss so we wouldn't lose any data. We built that all in. But simplified, everything is in the same, either pilot or co-pilot. Co-pilot is our mobile version of this application. Pilot is our desktop application. And everything flows back into the same content management group. We use encrypted government Amazon storage so that we can not directly hit back across our firewall, since we have a number of different counties that we're serving. We have a check-in, check-out at the Amazon point. But we kept it, we kept it pretty simple, and it works pretty well. We had, when we developed these applications in concert with our employees, often employees are not thrilled about being able to do their job in a different way. I don't think we could take this particular solution away from them. It really works well for them.
That's great. That's really good to hear. Okay, so there you have a couple of a county configuration and then the state of Washington mobile configuration. So let's move on to the next slide. And we're going to start our roundtable session, and we're going to talk about these particular topics: design and development methods and contracts, change management, configuration management, connectivity challenges, security, both physical and data, some training, and then what not to do, and definite should-dos. So let's get started. Next slide, please. And I'm going to prompt the Washington team, supported by Tom Kine, from his perspective. So, from an agile perspective, what lessons have you learned regarding development contracts and change management specific to supporting and maintaining your mobile application.
So are you talking Tom, kind of Minnesota?
Yes, but I'm going to start with the Washington team. Ann?
Oh, okay.
Yes, this is Ann Hunt with Washington. I was lead in the team effort to develop an RFP, conduct the procurement efforts, and do the contract management. So I'm speaking to this question. Anyway, our contract was specifically built for flexibility. So what that did was allow us to identify requirements in the RFP at a very high level, and then after we had the contractors, the designated contractors' response, it then allowed us to work with them to define the requirements at much more detail, as well as trade or modify ones that we had in the original RFP and contract. The paid deliverables for this contract were functional and technical architecture documents. The functional basically detailed the user stories that were developed at a detail level. It had API technical doc requirement, source codes, UAT results. We had a great component in our contract for agile coaching, which was all along the line, which occurred all during the development of our apps. And then we had specific off-site training with the vendors, agile and mobile training area. They also were required to develop training materials. Additional deliverables were requirement status and incidence reports, and just a regular status report that you would normally see for health of the project. Then the contract was for minimal viable products for both a caseworker and foster parent app. And both of them were designed with the expectation that the vendor would come in, sit with us side by side, develop the MVP, and then we knew that we would add future releases incrementally to add new features. Once the vendor was on board, we developed an agile team that was both the vendor and state staff. This team developed the backlog, the detailed user stories that we'd be working with, and then our product owner prioritized those user stories. Key requirements were audio and photo uploads, case notes, maps, and phone functionality. We did a little bit of trading, such as trading out a finger swipe function to build in a Washington audio recorder. Kevin will speak more to why we did that. Again, we had the agile coaching and training component in the contract. And then at the end of the contract, we used a sole source extension to keep the expertise that was needed for the tool until the state was fully able to take that over.
And I have a question. This was a new type of contract approved by your state procurement. Is that correct?
It was similar. We haven't really probably built out the ideal agile contract process that we want to utilize. So this one looked a little bit like a time and materials, but yes, it was approved by our contract staff. Actually, wrote it and executed the final document. So
great. Anything else regarding change management specific to supporting and maintaining your mobile app?
Well, this is Neil. We did go into this knowing that we were going to be building using the Xamarin tool that I mentioned previously, targeting the iOS platform. And in that, we trained up. Basically, we signed up with the Xamarin University and had staff go through the training, and then throughout the contract period, as Ann mentioned, we worked side by side in the same agile team. So rather than, in some cases in the past, we've kind of waited until the end and then said, okay, tell us everything you know so that we can take over the application ourselves. We've been bit by that. So throughout the entire development period, we sat side by side with these developers, and we knew what that application content was, how to make changes to it. And when we separated from the vendor, we owned that application and knew how to manage it. So, and we also staffed up a specific mobile development team to manage that change. And not too long after the vendor left, we made some significant enhancements to the application. We're very proud of that. So I think that was something that we knew going into it, that we had to know how to manage this thing.
Right. So I think what I hear you saying is that it's extremely important, and the lesson that you learned was to sit side by side with whomever your vendor is that's doing the development to pass on all information and expertise. Is that correct?
That's right. If you're developing a custom solution like this, that would be our advice.
Great. All right, Tom Kine from Minnesota, what can you add?
Well, I work across various divisions within DHS, but I'm actually with an IT organization that services all executive branch agencies, Joyce. So altogether, I'm supporting, or have been involved with about 6 mobile apps. And what I'd like to do is talk about development methodology and change management in the context of a different app, since what we're looking at here is a contracted, created solution. I do have an application that was in-house developed, custom HTML5, that's used for child care center compliance monitoring. And what I would say in regards to mobile app development is that the user experience is just absolutely critical to this kind of an application for it to be successful. So we used an agile methodology on that project. And early in, we focused simply on wireframes as opposed to zeroing in on the user interface, user experience. And as we got deeper into the functionality of the wireframing, and we're getting closer to having a releasable product, we engaged UI, UX expertise on a contracted basis to come in and do formal usability studies, and that was just immensely valuable to us. We had a far better solution at the end than I think we could have otherwise. So that expertise on the user interface, user experience is critical. The other thing I would emphasize on custom development or of any sort is or I suppose any implementation of a mobile platform is there's extensive change management needed with this. It's very difficult, in my experience, to be as efficient with a technology solution as pen and paper is in the field. I mean, there's nothing simpler than pen and paper and crossing something out. So it's difficult to sell, or I think it's a mistake to sell these applications as necessarily being more efficient. We really sold the application I'm talking about based on the increased capability, the accuracy, the consistency, the fact that we have data instead of marks on paper. And in the change management side, even extended beyond the user community, to other stakeholders, which in this case were child care center owners, so they understood what the application was going to do in regards to child care compliance monitoring, and into the legislature so that we had legislative backing as well, because there certainly can be political ramifications with some of these kinds of systems. So I would think those are general sorts of comments that are true across many mobile apps, and I'll let Mark go on to talk about the contracting process in Winona County.
All right. Well, a couple things. When we had already had a relationship with the vendors that we wanted to work with, so contracting when we did this really came about like we were used to. One of them. Somebody's back there. Anyways, we ID'd the project need. So the project need of having a mobile device handling social services out in the field. We conducted a discovery process. with vendors and all stakeholders to identify what the needs were on all sides, and hate to even bring lean into it, but almost conduct a current state, future state with some lean-ish project tenets, so that we could not just take a paper process and change it into a digital process, but actually clean it up and provide a better solution for the workers and their clients. After we get all that put together, we do a statement of work, and statement of work would be adjusted by speaking to the stakeholders again and making sure that it covered all the aspects that were brought out during discovery. Project implementation would begin. We would make adjustments as we moved when something would come up that no one had thought about, and then bring the project to fruition and be careful that we don't get into a project creep that causes an infinite project that never, ever ends because somebody wants a little change and a little change. The project has to end. And once we get to that point, we would have a after-action review and take a look at all aspects and make sure it met the needs. And pretty much after we were finished with that, we would start the project up again, because it would either be improvements or changes, and continue to improve our work so that everybody is able to do the work that they need to do, where they need to do it, and how they want to do it.
Okay, so I think what I heard both Tom and Mark stress is the importance of the end user involvement, whether getting them involved during the UI, user interface portion, or, as Mark said, get them involved initially in the requirements and development efforts. So that is pretty typical, I think. Let's move along, and we're going to move to the state of Washington, your team. The question is, configurations change because software is added, updated, or removed. Configuration management tools make implementing and enforcing these changes possible. Do you have any lessons learned regarding configuration management and the associated tools you may have used? Ann?
Yeah, this is.
Go ahead.
Neil's going to speak to that.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, this is Neil. The configuration management tools, basically we staffed up a specific team and trained them on the software and tools that were necessary, not just with the development, but also the deployment. With the iOS, we established a Jenkins continuous integration, continuous deployment process, and the necessary training that went along with that was part of the project scope that we learned from the vendor. And the provisioning and the account that we had to get with Apple to make that all happen, that was all part of the deliverable. So that was how we managed that. Do you have anything to add?
Okay, Tom Kine, do you have words of wisdom regarding lessons learned of configuration management and any associated tools?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's two fundamental approaches. Well, there's probably more, but there's two commonly used approaches to a mobile app. One via native applications, such as Washington is discussing. The other would be a browser-based application, such as HTML5. And I mean, what I would add is, or offer, is that the responsive browser-based application is far easier from a change management perspective, because it's certainly more in line with conventional development, and we're not worried about distributing an update to any devices on the endpoints. Again, I think from the perspective of a native app, we did have one early on that we used in a prototype basis here in Minnesota. It was a number of years ago, and we would distribute the application into the Apple Store, where users could get the current version. But I'll let Mark talk to how his solution handles configuration and change management.
Sure. This is Mark Anderson again. One of the things that we determined, since there's not just the mobile device and the mobile application or even HTML application running in a browser, we ended up with this integrated so tightly into the rest of our system that making a change to our content management system could ripple across the board. So we, at the beginning of this process, a number of years ago, we created a development, a test, and a production environment. Changes are all the time. This system is constantly organically changing, and to do that, we develop in development and test it before it goes out, and we can back up at any time. And knock on wood, we haven't had any major issues with our developments, and with our having to upgrade. Well, you upgrade the operating system on the server, you upgrade SQL, you upgrade the Northwoods application, you upgrade the Highland application, you upgrade with service packs for security's sake, you upgrade the mobile application. We have taken that twice divorced from the production group so that we can make sure that what we develop and deploy ends up not breaking anything else.
Great. Okay, so let's move along. And remote connectivity challenges can affect use of mobile devices in the field and thus caseworker productivity and timeliness. What lessons or processes can you share regarding working offline, such as data timeliness, reconciliation of data, or the synchronization of data from mobile to the main system? Mark, do you want to start us off on that?
Sure. Single database. Can't have multiple databases out there and expect that they're going to be compliant. We do some offline work, and we lock the database file that's being utilized, download it, upload it. We've paid special attention to this. You don't want to have multiple copies of the same data. And, it's been working pretty well so far. We're pretty pleased with the way this check-in, check-out of the files is going.
Great. So let's ask the Washington team about any remote connectivity challenges that they may have had.
Yeah, this is Neil. So we actually thought about this and designed it into the application for the social workers. And when they start up their phone, or it happens when you open the app, then it calls the APIs and loads up the data for all of their casework that's currently assigned to them. They go out throughout the day, and if they happen to be offline, that information that they're adding, the files that they're uploading, the notes that they're taking, any of the information that they're collecting in the field is stored in the SQLite database. And then when they come back into connectivity, basically there's a poll process that pings the network, and once it finds that it's connected, it synchronizes that information back up. And as I mentioned earlier, that was something that we were concerned about with the performance, because when you first fire up the app, some of these caseworkers have a large caseload, and they'll, get a lot of data to cross the wire, and so that's when we decided to load balance and use multiple API nodes. I might mention here that part of the contract was a public-facing foster parent application, and we have some lessons learned regarding the offline capability of that application that I want to share. Essentially, the idea was that the foster parents were contracted providers, and therefore we would give them Active Directory accounts which is the only way to go through the mobile device management tool. We worked with them to ensure that they understood the onboarding process, but in the end, it was somewhat unsuccessful because I think there was 26 or 27 steps in order to register your phone with the mobile device management tool to get the app. And a couple of the prompts say, we're going to take control of your phone, and if you lose it, we're going to wipe it out. And some of the language was a bit strong, so the buy-in for that was very low. So I think the lesson learned there was analyze your requirements carefully early on and make sure that the trade-off, if you're making a trade-off for offline capability, that the implications are well understood. We're since building a replacement for that application as a web-enabled or a mobile-enabled web application, which we think will be much more successful. But if you've got a lot of offline areas, it's something that you really have to think about.
So obviously the state of Washington is geographically pretty diverse in terms of the different counties, wherever they're located. Did you experience any remote connectivity challenges?
This is Kevin from Washington. So effectively, I'd be remiss to say no. We definitely have some remote areas that we have to address or what have you, which is why we started as our primary solution as a native application. But due to the connectivity challenges with that, we had to obviously look as a statewide implementation, what was really the value added to having those instances where you might be remote, to what information you can have, versus balancing the heaviness of the application, native versus, web applications and access through connectivity. So we had to balance that to make sure, as Neil pointed out earlier, there are some caseloads that are extremely large, and to get all that information downloaded timely while they have connectivity, then to be able to use offline, it's a balancing act. Do you set parameters as, you've got to log in and let your phone sit for 30 minutes inside the network to make sure that it downloads everything so you can work with your application and have your information, balancing that. So we're taking a thoughtful approach as we go forward, and as we add anything to address that connectivity challenge, looking at something native versus a web application, and just making the business decisions that say, because of the nature of this work, we are going to require connectivity to submit that information or to use that application. Conversely, though, some of those areas that are critical, such as case notes, some of the safety documentation, as we look at that, as Neil's already talked about, we actually have the capability, a queuing system, that the worker can complete that work offline, and then as soon as they get inside the network, it'll ping it and it will upload that. So it's a balancing act for us.
Right. Thank you very much. Let's move along and let's talk about the lessons that you've learned to protect the physical security of your mobile devices. So what is your protocol if a device breaks, is stolen, or is lost? Mark, let's start with you.
There's two physical security portions to it. We provide an armored case for those devices. I've been working in the field for a while. People drop a lot of stuff. So we try to protect the device from drops. But in the case where the device would be lost, left, stolen, it's secured and will auto-wipe if it's attempted to enter your password more than, I think we have it set at 3 times. And we also have MDM, so we can brick the device remotely at any time if it's reported missing.
And MDM stands for?
Mobile Device Management.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Washington, what is your protocol for the physical security of your devices?
This is Kevin from Washington, and I'll start with what we've already heard. Is we have that same concept with regard to the MDM for the device management, where a container on the device, if the device is lost, stolen, etc., we have the capability from remotely to wipe that container, which would contain any of that native application, any of that data. We're able to do that remotely as well. with regard to, lost, stolen, and the actual physical of the device, we have our protocols with regard to reporting that in a timely fashion and then going through the process. One of the caveats that we have, is I just like to touch on it. This was important to us. When we set up our mobile application, anybody who's used a mobile phone knows that the user gets some parameters to what the app says you can and can't do and what's enabled and what's disabled. One of the things we did, we made it required for them to go ahead and give location access always as a capability to actually log in and use this application. So we didn't give them the ability to turn on location and still use the app, because then obviously that would create some vulnerabilities for us with regard to be able to find that device and be able to wipe that information.
So, Washington, does the state supply all the devices to the end users in the counties?
Yeah, this is Kevin from Washington. Yes, that was actually something that we engaged in prior to actually procuring and developing and implementing mobile applications. Was we had decided to move forward for lots of reasons. One, it made sense, and two, we had governor directive to become a mobile workforce. So we had actually already begun the implementation of iPhones and tablets to our users, social workers, so on and so forth. And the iPhone was the decided device from, at that time, our leadership that made the determination that we would have one platform that we would develop to internally.
So another question is, with your iPhone implementation, is the end user, can they run their own unique apps on their iPhones?
So this is Kevin from Washington again. No, so the Mass 360 actually gives us the capability, because they're corporate devices, to manage that entire device, which includes creating an application store effectively. I apologize for not knowing the exact term, but the only apps that they're allowed to deploy or to download onto the device come through the Mass 360 management device. And so with that, we control which applications they have, whether we enable, disable, so on and so forth. iPhone, yes, does have some proprietary pieces that we cannot control as far as their apps, but we have some control over it. This might be a good example I could use to just demonstrate what we're talking about here. The audio recorder, we've actually disabled the audio recorder, the iPhone native audio recorder that comes with the device, because that created some inherent challenges as us doing our investigatory interviews, creating audio recordings of these, because the iPhone required us to go through iTunes, and that was something that was not going to happen with our investigatory interviews. So we actually had to build an audio recorder native inside of our application to do the audio recordings and be able to upload into our system.
So that is that's a very interesting lesson learned there.
Yeah, I spoke. It was on our list earlier for a little bit later, so I apologize for jumping the gun on that.
That's fine. So, Mark, my assumption is that the county purchases your devices?
It's identical. We took all those same steps. We own all the devices. We don't allow additional software deployment on the devices that we own. We control it through our mobile device manager to publish apps that we do allow, and we don't use any of the Apple built-in applications for recording or iTunes or any of that stuff. We keep it all in-house in the app that has been deployed on the phones or on the devices.
Great. Thank you. So let's move on, and let's talk about the end users and field staff and caseworkers. So we're going to start with Michelle from Carver County, I believe. What key lessons did you learn when rolling out the mobile app to your field staff and caseworkers? Did you encounter? Go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you. We are using the same system as Mark is talking about with Winona County. Some of our key learnings were to spend time on the setup, test it for at least 2 months before you implement it across the department. Spend time teaching new habits. And remember, it takes time to learn. Remember that learning is only 10% of doing the actual training, 20% reflection, and 70% of doing. So plan for the ongoing support long term. It's not that you implement and you're done. Also, identify early on who will be your detractors. So those least willing to do this, and involve them early on in the process of implementation. Also think big picture. So not just about implementation, but long term. So how will this work with when you bring in new people? How will you add new forms as the laws change? That kind of thing. And then also involve workers early on so they're part of the implementation and it isn't just being done to them, and this will help get them invested.
Okay. Did you encounter any major surprises when you were training staff to use the mobile app?
Absolutely. Probably the biggest one was don't assume that workers will do it even if you set up deadlines, because, doing child welfare work, there's a lot of unexpected things that happen. So just because you say do it doesn't mean they're going to necessarily do it. So you want to find a way to monitor the use and provide the support when they need it. Also, don't assume that everyone will know how to use the technology. We were quite surprised that we had to spend some time just teaching basic instruction around how to use the iPad.
So I am sure that your workforce is very diverse in terms of maturity. So I would assume that your younger end users, your younger caseworkers were excited for the technology to be rolled out and have had significant experience using either an iPhone or a tablet.
Absolutely.
The other portion of your workforce, what did you run into in terms of them being hesitant to use the technology?
Well, it was important to balance the workload. That was part of it. So, like you said, our younger social workers really caught on, and they were teaching some of us who have been around a few decades. We really brought those social workers on as testers, and they're now our trainers. But what we failed to do, though, for them was to take away some of the work as they're helping us with this other implementation. We also learned that we needed to plan for other processes like court discovery. How are we going to use this process to help us get our court discovery quicker, more efficiently, paperless? It was also important that we looked at the timing of our implementation. We didn't think about that, and we planned some of our go dates around big court deadlines or time deadlines, and that really got in the way for workers. And then the other thing we noticed is whatever you do to help prepare them, it won't work for everyone. So we had a lot of scanning parties and countdowns, but that just really stressed some workers out where it supported other people's change.
Excellent. Thank you so very much. And I'm going to ask the Washington team, what was the most frequent challenge or obstacle you got pushback from your end users?
Thank you. This is Christian from the state of Washington. And really I wanted to echo most everything Michelle said. We experienced the same. We learned a lot as we went through the process. Our original plan was we were going to build such an intuitive app on an easy-to-use iPhone that we wouldn't have a plan for any of this. We would simply hand it over. as we met with our users, we quickly woke up and realized that wasn't really a plan. And so we hit those issues early on, and then we created a full-fledged IT training team, again, located within our IT shop, and we made a plan for them to roll out to our 45 offices and be on the ground in the offices, training on the app, and more importantly, training on the actual phone itself.
Did you bring any of that field staff in to join your in-house training team?
Yes, we did that, and that was instrumental in having those early wins and preventing further issues. And luckily, we adapted early on, preventing later crises. And we stationed them out in those offices for the rollout, and then again, as Michelle said this earlier, we had them available after rollout to answer those questions, to hear how it was being used, to adjust what we thought was our plan for the use. I think one of the keys for us also in that usage, as we had mentioned, we had that plan of if you build it, they will come. And we said, gave them the app and said, kind of stood back and pat ourselves on the chest and said, great, incorporate it into your daily work. Make this part of your case management. And that's where we kind of had some lessons where luckily we had some early adopters, not maybe who we thought we were. It wasn't necessarily just the younger groups. We had, a good collection of people who were early adopters, and we used them to see how they used it, how they took this extra piece and rolled it into their more traditional case management work. And then we kind of used them to champion this throughout the other offices and use that as our lessons learned on this is what it looks like into your daily work.
Great. So I'm curious now, as you make changes to the app or any type of change, what is your training resource? Do you use web-based training, or do you still do on-site training, or do you do both?
We do all that, and anything the users request is reasonable. And again, we find that we love the idea of web-based trainings or having materials that people can view offline. But again, we identified that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution, so we've continued to offer that on-site available approach for users and constantly checking in and updating that material as it goes, knowing that it's, again, going into our agile processes that we constantly revisit and refocus them.
And this is Kevin. I'd just like to add to that. With regard to our training process, we've actually taken a multi-tiered approach, meaning identifying multiple ways users learn and then having that available. I mean, everything from your immersive learning to your classroom trainings, depending on what's being pushed out, how it impacts their work. And then, as Christian spoke to earlier, not really having a vision of how it might fit into the workflow or how they might modify their existing workflow. That's now part of our training. And like, hey, this is technology, and here's how you might use it, and start trying to plant seeds to those workers, and through either micro-learnings or through the videos or whatever mechanism we need to do. And the piece that's really critical for us is we want to own the technology, but getting our business partners to embrace it and own the technology to find a way to incorporate it into their practice is beyond critical. Anything we've been successful with from a technology standpoint of implementing has had business buy-in from the get-go. Even if technology seems to make sense, if our business partners do not buy into it, our users really struggle to incorporate it and implement it.
Thank you so very much. Let's move on, and this is directed to the Washington team and to Tom Kine and to Mark. When developing your mobile solutions, how accurate were your cost estimates, and then what were the unexpected costs?
This is Ann with Washington. our contract was, again, much like a time and material. So we had a specified time frame and a specified amount for the first original contract. Of course, when we got to the end of that, we wanted more, so we were allowed within our contract limits to extend it for dollars and for time for a few more months. After that, we were not able to extend it any longer, and we would have had to re-procure. So my best advice is, whatever your funding allows, so ours was funding limited, but get the most that you can from your vendor before you let them go. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, we weren't quite ready to take over the Xamarin on our own, so we did do a sole source contract to extend that expertise, the vendor expertise for that.
Great, thank you. Tom Kine, what words do you have?
Well, Joyce, I can't think of anything specific to mobile solution that's different than a conventional solution in regards to cost estimates. I think it just all boils down to having good requirements and understanding what you're trying to do and estimating accordingly. So nothing is coming to mind that is different with mobile.
Great.
That I can
Thank
pick
you.
up.
Thank you. Mark, do you have a...
I agree with Tom in this. The main thing that we've seen, we do a pretty tight estimate of time, and it does kind of go, like Washington said, a time material, so you're doing something new that you haven't broken that type of ground before. But what we've seen, and we always guard against, is scope creep. As soon as the battle's joined, it seems to fall apart a little bit unless you keep a tight hand on it and keep it moving towards the goals that you had set. But that'd be about it. It's really no different than any other new style project.
Great. Thank you very much. So let's move on and let's talk about for our mobile implementations, what are some of the things that you should not do?
So, Joyce,
Go ahead, Tom.
Go ahead. Well, I was going to say, this may seem obvious once I say it, but the limitation of the system in Minnesota is that it has read-only access to the SACWIS data, and that definitely is a limitation. We're going to fix that with CWIS, and I'm excited to do that. So it does limit the utility of the solution quite a bit. So they're able to pull data out of the SACWIS system in order to pre-fill their forms, but there's no provision to push data back into the SACWIS. So that I was pretty eager to jump out there and say is definitely a not to do, and it may be obvious to everyone else.
And then it definitely should do, right?
Yes.
Okay. Washington team, what are some of the things that you definitely are not to do that you want to share with your colleagues across the country?
So this is Kevin in Washington. I don't think we have enough time left on this to go over everything. This was an amazing opportunity for us to learn a lot of do's and don'ts. But just to highlight a couple of keys, what not to do. One of the key things not to do is to enter it as a technology project and really make sure that your business has an investment from the get-go. Washington began this as we want to advance in new technology to support our workers. That's a heart of gold, and it's a vision and a belief, and we want to embrace that. The difference is it was IT-led, and we didn't really have the opportunity or afforded our business the opportunity to embrace and engage up front. So it was a scramble once we were into the process of really identifying and defining doing the careful analysis of our refinement and getting critical requirements and getting those critical elements. Now, with that said, we hit home runs on many of them, but there were areas we could have done better or repurposed the time that we built certain requirements in that weren't necessarily as much value added to our business partners. So that's what not to do. And it's easy for technology shops to say, this is amazing technology. They use it in their everyday life. Let's jump onto it. but don't get ahead of your overall agency and your organization on the business side. And if, like most states, I'm sure, child welfare moves very purposefully. That's translation. It moves a little bit slower, and so you want to make sure IT doesn't jump out in front of it. That's probably our biggest don't. Neil, did you have any don'ts from the technical side of things?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we sat with the vendor. We understood the code. The knowledge transfer was clear. That was from an application management standpoint. That was one of my big priorities. Make sure we don't end up with something that we're tied to the vendor in order to support. Yeah, that's about all I had.
Okay, from the end user perspective, from the caseworker perspective, Michelle, what is it that you should not do?
So a couple different things is definitely don't assume this is going to be easy because, as I heard Tom say earlier, change management takes a lot of time and it's an ongoing process. So don't assume you train everyone so therefore your implementation is done. Just remember that this will be an ongoing process that you need to plan for.
Okay, Mark?
Mine's more philosophy-oriented. Don't be frozen by the difficulty of it. It's worth it to go through this type of a process, develop this type of business tool for the folks. It's just don't be frozen by the difficulties and the challenges. Keep moving forward.
Great. So now we talked a little bit, well, we kind of mixed in some of the things that you definitely should do along with those that should definitely not do. Does anyone have any additional very important things that you should do when you're trying to implement a mobile solution for your caseworkers?
This is Michelle from Carver. I could certainly speak to that.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think it's really important that you look at past implementations and take into account what worked and didn't work and do more of what worked. So I think it's important that you look at the culture of change within the organization when you plan this. Also, I think it's important to look at the diffusion of innovation theory, and I've heard some reference of this on the call today. Include your early adopters as well as your laggards, or those detractors, those that will take more time in your implementation early on. That really helped us. We also had to plan for regular meetings way after the implementation to talk about the ongoing struggles or the needs and really involve our IT folks. We realized that we implemented and we thought it was done, but it clearly wasn't. It's an ongoing process. The other thing I didn't do that you should do is planning your budget for iPads that get broken, for stylus costs, for backup replacements every 3 years. So there's the ongoing cost that I didn't necessarily think about up front. And then make it fun. You know, for me, with a bunch of social workers, we did all kinds of things. We counted down. We celebrated our successes with slideshows. We had huddles. We even did a song based on our implementation called Chuck and the Mountain of Paperwork, and based on the song Can't Stop This Feeling. So we found all kinds of ways to have fun during the implementation process as well.
Great. So I like the take an inventory of necessary things like power cords, et cetera, and also to create an age-out plan so you can continue to bring in new hardware.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. Cool. So, all right, before we go to our attendee Q&A session, does anyone on our panel have any additional should-dos?
This is Kevin from Washington, and I do. So we've been talking a lot about the implementation and the engagement. One of the things that I should do, and this was talked about and it was brought from our development side of things, is the ability to be able to track usage at all different variables. Business won't necessarily know what they want to be able to report and what have you, but from an implementation standpoint and an onboarding standpoint and the engagement and validating the value of it, it was critical for us to be able to parse out and be able to identify what features are being used, how many people are using it, how many unique people. And it seems simple, but we had to give it a lot of thought, and we had to go back and add different elements that we've captured behind the scenes to be able to report out on that. And what that then translated to is we were able to give to our training team, and they did statewide contests that had small prizes, and it wasn't financially taxing or burdening, but it just gave them the incentive and, their names and lights about usage and just little pieces along the way, whatever works for your area. But if you don't plan for it up front, it becomes heavy technical debt to try to build that and figure it out after the fact. So be thoughtful when you're doing it. Plan, have technology built to be able to support that implementation. That would be it.
Absolutely. And thank you so very much. So let's move on to the next slide, please. So that concludes the discussion portion of the roundtable, and I certainly hope it was informative and helpful to all of you who are attending. I would now like to invite my colleague, Nick, to run the Q&A session. Nick, please.
Hello there, everyone. So for our Q&A session, you can either type in a question into the chat box, or operator, would you please remind our attendees how they can ask a question over the phone?
Thank you. We will now begin the question and answer session. To ask a question, please press star followed by 1. Please ensure your phone is unmuted and record your name clearly when prompted. Again, that is star followed by 1 to ask a question. To withdraw your request, press star 2.
Nick, are you there?
This is Nick. I'm here. We don't have any questions in the box right now, and we have a great group of panelists here who can answer whatever you might have. So I encourage folks to please type away or follow the operator's instructions as she just did.
And we currently have no questions on the audio either.
Okay. Well, while we wait for any of our attendees to either call in or use the chat box. Tom, I think we missed you on some of the shoulds or some of the do nots. Can you help us out with some should do's?
Well, I'd go back to what I said earlier, Joyce, which is be conservative and advertising the benefits that this will bring, particularly if you haven't tried to roll out a mobile solution before. You're far better to under-promise and over-deliver with this. And if productivity gains may come over time, but you're not going to get them at first. So I would be very cautious about how you present this from a change management perspective, emphasize the qualitative benefits that are coming in regards to data quality, improved timeliness, and so on and so forth, as opposed to across the board, this is going to be easier, faster. Hopefully it turns out to be the case, but that may come over time. So I would tread lightly on that.
Let me ask if any one of our panelists experience any pushback from their executive management in to develop a mobile application and to push out iPhones and iPads. How did your executive management view the distribution of that type of technology out in the field?
This is Mark Anderson. That pretty funny question, actually, because when we started this process, executive manager and myself really partnered to make this a big organizational change in a new direction. But you know what happens in government? people get elected and people don't get elected, and things change. And it became less supported as we went on, even though we were right at the end of the project. It was less supported by the executive management of our organization, and it ultimately was supported through the end, but it was pretty touch and go for a little bit. It's not inexpensive. It's a large change to the organization at every level, the way they work. And, that was something that I didn't plan when I started working forward. I guess it happens in government, right?
Yes, it does. Washington, any comments?
Sure. This is Kevin from Washington. We actually had very good leadership buy-in from the get-go, and I mentioned earlier that we actually had a governor's executive order with regard to the mobility and getting a mobile workforce. So we had already had that at the highest level in Washington. And then from the child welfare side of things, we actually had leadership buy-in. There was lots of discussion. Even though it may have started out as a technology-driven, there was buy-in from our executive leadership there. The only challenge that I would say there is the executive leadership buy-in doesn't necessarily equate to top-down direction that we're going to embrace and we're going to go this direction. And so we did have challenges at different levels, but not at the executive level.
Okay, thank you. Michelle, how about from your agency perspective? Did they support mobility, a mobile solution, or not?
Absolutely, because I believe they saw it as a more efficient way. So it was either bring in more staff or find a way to become more efficient. And this really helped us become more efficient. And our data is showing that it is working for us. So we were lucky to have great support behind it.
Great, thank you. Nick, I think we have some questions.
Hi, Joyce, that we do. Do we have any questions over the phone before I dive into the ones in the chat box?
No, there are no questions on the phone.
Thank you, operator. So the first question is, what effect did the new CWIS rules have on your development approach?
Hi, this is Neil with Washington State. As I mentioned earlier, we are building a modular, we have our SACWIS system, which we've identified our state as a CWIS.
A transitional CWIS, yes. So that makes a lot of difference.
Yes, so we are a transitional state. But as we added the new pieces of work and the API layer for the mobile network, we built that in a modular way. And so what we're doing is we're keeping our business logic together logically, and then the core programming separate from that. So things like authorization, authentication, logging, approvals, all that functionality that's system-wide, we put that in a separate module, separate from business case or business-specific logic. So that's some of the stuff that we kept in mind. Also using a tiered architecture where the responsive web applications have a front end, basically a presentation layer, and then the API layer is separate from that. So we can utilize the API layer in more than just the web application. We can use it for mobile. We can use it for interfaces and other functionality. So modularity is really what our focus has been.
Tom?
I would pretty much second that with a slightly different twist, which would be in Minnesota, the CWIS, the CWIS regulations are going to give us the opportunity to correct that one-way interface, make it a two-way interface. I expect that we'll be not using over the long term an ODBC access to the database, but that we will have RESTful services. We already have separation of our business logic, so we're pretty modular to begin with. But this is a good opportunity to make the solution more valuable to the entities that are using it.
Thank you. Now, do we have any questions over the phone?
No, there's one moment, please. One just came in.
Go ahead.
Carla Young, may go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, I am from New Mexico, and I'm sorry if you covered this in the beginning. I was a couple minutes late. I was curious if any of the states are using e-signature for agreements, safety planning, foster parent documents, and how you negotiated that piece.
So this is Kevin from Washington. I'll go ahead first, if that's all right. So we currently do not have any e-signatures embedded in our mobile apps and or in our existing technology. We're in our early stages of implementing that. We're getting walkthroughs with various vendors and looking at that. It is a high need for our agency in multiple program areas, and so we're working to implement that. But current time, that is not part of our solution.
Nick?
Thank you, Joyce. So the next question that we have is related to training. Did you provide training prior to the rollout of the device, meaning working with family, with mobile solution, role-playing, etc.?
Michelle, how about you take that one?
Sure, I'd love to. I would say lots and lots of training, and it never ends. So we did, like I said before, training is only 10%, 20% is reflection, 70% is doing. So we did the initial rollout, and then we practiced, and then we came back and we reflected, how's it working, what's not working. So we got together weekly in huddles and talked about our biggest learnings together. And then still as an ongoing basis, where I'm running reports to look at utilization and to look at the low utilization to see what does that person need for support. So we actually even trained in the field. So there's a lot of things that happen when you go to sign a document. We do have the signature embedded in our mobile application. So when you go to sign the application, how you help people do that, how do you set up your iPad, do you use a stylus, do you not use a stylus? So definitely trained in the field as well as in the office and continue on an ongoing basis.
Great. Nick?
Thank you, Joyce. So the next question that we have, it piggybacks a little bit on a previous conversation topic about pushback. This is more related to users, it looks like. So how much pushback, if any, did you receive if you chose to support only one device?
So this is Kevin from the state of Washington. We didn't have any pushback, basically because the devices had already been. There was no option. It was mandated that this would be our device of usage. I mean, we had some other inherent challenges with regard to not necessarily pushback on the device, but pushback from particular areas or down to units that whether the leadership there, the local leadership wanted their workers to use the device or not, but not with regard to the device selection, not the platform.
So that may be an interesting question to pose to Mark, given the state-managed, county-administered environment. Being that the county purchased your devices, do you support multiples, and did you get any pushback?
We support the iOS platform, and when we developed Florida was always developing, and at the time, of course, there wasn't as many mobile devices that were available that had the inherent security that the iPad had. No, we didn't get any pushback at all. In fact, when we provide other devices, strictly mobile cell phone devices, we're agnostic. We'll support an Android or an iOS device if it's just to provide communications. And I would say 95% of the people select an iOS device.
Okay, cool. Nick, I think we have time for maybe one more question.
All right, thank you, Joyce. So the final question is, how far in advance from rollout did you start your countdown to get the workforce engaged?
Anybody can jump in.
So this is Kevin from Washington. So I'll go quick because I heard somebody else want to answer it too. We tried to do the just-in-time approach with regard to our implementation. We definitely did the rolling outreach with regard to usability to finalize some of the designs and some of the approach. But we tried to do it just in time, literally because it wasn't a required usage. We pretty much did it like the week of as we rolled out. And then we did a gradual rollout across different offices. We didn't dump it to all 45 at one point because we didn't have enough to support it, so we did a rolling release.
Yeah.
And this is...
Okay, go ahead, Michelle.
This is Michelle. I was going to say we started a year in advance, really involved them in the process, had them on the implementation team, the training team, and so they knew what was coming, so it wasn't a surprise, I guess.
Mark?
I could just say ditto. That's exactly what we did. 1 year from discovery to implementation, involving the people that were going to be affected all the way so that they wouldn't be surprised by anything that came out the other side.
Great. All right. Well, I think that we can end our Q&A session and move on to the next slide, which is a bit of a wrap-up. I want to extend a huge thank you to Ann and Kevin and Neil and Christian and Tom and Michelle and Mark. Just as a side, it wasn't a chat question, but there was a comment that came in from one of our attendees that simply says, thanks, great webinar. So that's to you folks. So if you'd like to contact any of the panelists directly, please direct your inquiry to my colleague, Nick Mosier, and that's nicholas.mosier@hhs.gov.
That email address is nicholas.moser@acf.hhs.gov.
This webinar has been recorded and will be made available online. When it is complete and posted, a message will be sent announcing availability on the Children's Bureau website. So as we move forward in our series, we are in the planning stage for a webinar regarding the Data Quality Technical Bulletin. So thank you for attending, and that ends the Roundtable discussion webinar. Goodbye.